Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about something socially worrying, which is the concept, essentially from John Calhoun, of the behavioral sink. And I think we're seeing evidence of that at work in the world today. Now, part of this comes from simply observing what's happening in the world and drawing sort of a comparison to his own experiments with mice. Of course, that's sort of the basis of much of modern experimental medicine, is essentially experimenting on mice first because it's unethical to do it to human populations. I may take some issue with that, general idea, but be that as it may, it's the way it's done. So first, simply an observation of that, and also an observation of how, once again, there's a similarity between, and I've said this in several other videos, there's a similarity between third wave feminism and men going their own way, or the lunatic fringe of men's rights activists. The average MRA is primarily interested in legal reform, which I almost fully support, but then you've got the wingnuts that basically fulfill one of Calhoun's own experimental models, one of the observations that he made about the decline of a population over time. Now, the first thing I need to say is that there's a difference, a measurable difference between carrying capacity absolutely used and what you might term comfort capacity. That is, when you're even near carrying capacity, you begin to have social problems, you begin to have problems with supply and demand, you begin to have all sorts of problems. I would argue that this world surpassed, however, comfort capacity decades ago, and that 5 or 6 billion people can comfortably live on this world, and that anything above and beyond that is excess, and is narrowing down the amount of resources available to others. I see in Calhoun's experiments with the behavioral sink there. And well, first I should probably describe specifically what was done. Essentially, the idea of the experiment is this, with his mouse experiments. You take a population of mice, you give them limitless food in an enclosed area, and see what happens. That's basically what he did. The mouse population grew and grew and grew, but eventually it hit a point, it hit its carrying capacity, and it stopped reproducing. The population began to decline, and here is what was strange. It wasn't just a decline in population, it wasn't just a stabilization at that highest rate at which they can possibly survive amongst one another in closed quarters. They didn't simply remain at that stable level of population. They crashed, that's the first thing. This has been observed before. Population hits that level, something causes it to crash. They get a disease, they run out of resources because of some climactic fluctuation or disaster or something, or their population just crashes in this case because there was no such external factor. It collapsed because of behavioral changes within the population. Specifically, there are two that concern us here when we're looking at the modern era. We can look at some countries in the world and say they've hit that level. They're at or above carrying capacity. Their populations have begun to decline. This is the case in much of Europe. It's the case in Japan and in other parts of Asia. It's now beginning to be the case in China, which doesn't bode well for them. It's happening in some areas of the United States, specifically sort of the northeastern region where the population density did max out a while ago, as opposed to some of the more empty rural states where that hasn't actually happened yet. And because of our own land usage, restrictions may never happen in some of these locations, which is, in observation of Calhoun's experiments, probably a good thing. It happens in these heavily urbanized, overcrowded regions. Then you get the idea of a place like New York City where you can't really cram anybody in because you've already built it up basically as much as you can with our current technology, and it just becomes a giant resource sponge. That is, a great deal of wealth may be created there, but it's artificial wealth. It's not actually producing any sort of goods other than some manufactured goods and then shipping them back out, essentially because you can't grow anything in a place like New York City, and agriculture is impossible. There aren't any mines. But I know I'm getting a little bit off topic. The basic premise is this. In Calhoun's experiments, when the population began to hit that critical mass, that carrying capacity, or possibly go above carrying capacity, several behaviors were documented in the mouse population that should be worrying for people. Males that were submissive and uninterested in the female sex, they were uninterested in breeding and became solitary. They became self-absorbed to the capacity that a mouse can be egotistical and sort of selfish. That's what they became. On the other side, domineering, dominant, aggressive females who also had no interest in breeding but almost took on an alpha male role. These are the two things that Calhoun observed and documented within his experimentation with the behavioral sink. I see this happening right now. When I look at third wave feminism, I'm not talking about suffragettes, I'm not talking about women want pay equality, I'm not talking about women want the right to own property. I'm not or to be treated equally under the eyes of the law. I'm talking about modern, postmodern, third wave feminism in what appears to be a social justice crusade specifically to convince men that there's something wrong with them. Other associated ideas, men are the problem, men are horrible, we should, avoid all men. We shouldn't have kids because it's the patriarchy, it's oppression of some sort. And they get very loud and in your face about this many times, it appears. And it roughly mimics what you might think of as Calhoun's observation. The difference, of course, being a mouse isn't capable of the same range of emotional arguments. The mouse isn't capable of the same range of intelligent or unintelligent sort of banter in support of their opinion. When I see organizations dedicated to third wave feminism, I say they are basically an anthropic attempt to explain the emotionally aberrant behaviors that had already been observed in Calhoun's experiments on mice. That is, the aberrance is exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is that because humans are not mice, they're capable of holding discourse and debate, there is an attempt to excuse why that aberrance is okay, or tolerated, or even applauded, even superior in some way to some established rational social order. When I look at the other side, I see another similarity, and this is why I say third wave feminism and MGTOW are basically the same thing for different genders. The male population, which has involved itself with the more irrational aspects of these movements, have become like the so-called beautiful ones within Calhoun's experiment. They are uninterested in females. In fact, they are outright hostile to being around them in many cases. They're uninterested in what you would consider mating rituals. For humans, that would be dating or whatever. They're uninterested in territoriality over females. They're also submissive. They are physically submissive. They may act mentally dominant, but they show submissive characteristics. They have no biological drive to find and acquire a mate. They have no biological drive to compete with other males over what biologically tends to be competed over first and foremost, which is breeding rights. We see this in every animal species on the planet. You can say that this is chauvinistic or misogynistic or whatever. I'm not saying, well, females, behind men. I'm not saying that. I'm saying biologically speaking, that's an innate biological drive for the entire male group of the species. Now you can go into like, well, what about homosexuals? Well, that's documented in animal species too. I'm not saying that that's behavioral sink related aberrance, because clearly it's not. That happens in smaller populations too that aren't, under any sort of, we're near carrying capacity style stress. So I mean, that's a totally different issue altogether. It has nothing to do with what Calhoun was talking about. What he was talking about is that the population eventually collapses because these social aberrances become more and more widespread over time. Now, it's going to take us a hell of a lot longer to get to the level where the majority of the population stops being interested in such things. But there's another piece of proof that this is what we are witnessing, and that's the nation of Japan. Japan hit its carrying capacity decades and decades and decades ago. Its population has been stagnant for quite some time. They are undergoing exactly what Calhoun witnessed in his mouse populations. Males and females are both largely uninterested in breeding. In fact, a lot of people in Japan no longer even date. They simply don't see it as something they're interested in. They would rather pamper themselves or work or do something else they find productive, but they're not breeding. The majority of the Japanese population is not breeding. Their population is going to collapse. In the next 50 years, the population of Japan will probably decline by 50% or more on this basis. They're simply not having kids, and those that are, they have one kid. They're not at replacement levels, nowhere near them. Their population is going to absolutely plummet as their older and middle-aged generations approach geriatric age and begin to die. Their population is going to be a lot lower. They may or may not actually recover from this. Unfortunately, because the amount of time between them hitting their carrying capacity and parts of the Western world doing it is rather small, we won't be able to have enough time looking at what happens to them in their own population to determine whether it's going to happen elsewhere and specifically what will happen. It could be different from Calhoun's experimentation on the basis that humans biologically may act in a similar manner to a mouse as far as breeding and ritualism and stuff like that goes. But there's also an added element of intelligence that, I mean, does, honestly, it goes beyond other species. That is, we're more complex mentally speaking. Our communication capabilities are more complex. We have a deep introspective thought not witnessed in these other species, and we may be able to find some way to work around this. For instance, if you look at Europe, what are they doing as the result of their own domestic population not breeding at replacement rates? They're bringing in immigrants. This will necessarily lead, eventually, to the dying off of the dominant cultures there. It will eventually lead to their replacement by third world cultures. This is what will happen to Europe unless they change the way in which they are doing things. Unfortunately, though, there's ultimately no other solution for those or any other culture, because the entire world is making that steady march now towards carrying capacity. In fact, I would argue that in a place like Japan or Italy or Germany or the UK or France, carrying capacity was left behind a long time ago. Comfort capacity in some of these regions was attained 100 years ago. They're well above their carrying capacity. They've been artificially buoyed by abnormally good weather in some areas, by technology that may not always be there, and the world population could collapse back down. When I see these social movements in which people are saying the other gender sucks, you have sort of the gender war feel to it. All that is an observable change in the population's own ethos as the result of being too overcrowded and having too much. In our case, in the case of the West, you don't have the problem of being stretched for resources to the same extent. When a person goes into the grocery store, look at all the resources that are there. It seems inexhaustible. It doesn't even need to be inexhaustible, by the way. It simply needs to be perceived as being inexhaustible. A person can only eat so much. They can only consume so many goods reasonably without killing themselves. There's also a maximum rate at which they can absorb resources, unless they happen to be rich enough to stockpile them, like some fucking Rockefeller or some shit like that. But we're seeing the behavioral sink at work. This world is several billion people above its comfort capacity. Easily. Probably several more billion on top of that. Our comfort capacity in this world is probably between 3 and maybe 6 billion. Well, we're well above that. We're marching on towards our maximum carrying capacity. Now, science has proposed, well, that's okay. We'll just increase our technology. We've got vertical farming and green energy and all of the... We'll compact cities more. We'll open up new space for agriculture. Fuck the rainforest. We'll just turn that into a giant farm. Science appears to believe that the way to deal with the fact that we're approaching carrying capacity at an astonishing rate, especially in parts of Africa where most of those immigrants to the rest of the world are coming from, or parts of Asia which are overcrowded and they just sort of outsource their own population and don't give a fuck, they appear to think, oh, well, technology will do it for us. Unless you intend to begin colonizing other planets, though, you're going to run into problems. There is still a finite number of resources on this planet. I would say, look at parts of the world now and how much water stress there is. Well, you can't just simply magically create more water resources in any, large-scale system. So you're going to eventually have, no excess of water. People will be living bottle to bottle, essentially, just to survive. Comfort capacity denotes that people are able to live a dignified existence, not simply survive to an old age and reproduce at replacement levels, as carrying capacity allows them to do so. Comfort capacity is less densely populated, with the idea that there have to be some recreational wild spaces left. There has to be some fallow land. You cannot simply have everybody work 40 hours a week for their entire existence, and you know, if one person decides to retire, all of society breaks down because you end up with a famine. You can't have such a system. You can't have such a system in which people are packed in like sardines and treated like animals, because that's basically all there are. There's no value given to human life. There's no value given to individual human life. There's no value given to collective human life. The governments and scientists of the world developed all of these nuclear weapons and things like that can basically destroy the entire world, but they still haven't figured out how we're going to actually live in this world. We are fast approaching the level at which the resources of this world will be stretched so thinly that it will be impossible for the average person to live a dignified existence, unless you intend to terraform other planets and begin colonizing them. You will run out of room on this planet. When you do, the populations will do exactly what the Japanese are doing now, and they will collapse. And this will lead to another Dark Ages. It won't mean that the human race goes extinct, because what you got to realize is that there's a bit of a difference between a mouse population, which the mouses live in maybe 100 days or something, and breeding relatively quickly, and a generation doesn't last that long. There's a difference between that and a human generation of 10, 20 years, and, you know, average lifespan 65 to 80 or so, around there. There's a difference. Some humans would begin breeding again as that population stress was taken off by the collapse. But do we really want that sort of collapse in the first place? The only other ideas are, number one, you can establish the idea of a comfort capacity in which land is not infinitely subdivided, infinitely settled, in which there are rural areas, which means even if you have hit the uppermost population you can attain with the system that you've created, it's still not densely packed in there for the most part, which means you don't have the collapse. You stay at replacement rate because the resources available are still in excess of what you overall need. So you don't have the problem of collapse, potentially. The experiments done with mice assume crowding them in more and more and more. Well, that's what's happening in some parts of the world. There are ways to avoid this. That's number one. Number two, you could have a giant nuclear war and kill off most human beings and hope that whoever's left decides to reproduce. Oh, you know, the problem being you just irradiated the world. Another possibility is open up other planets, and then the other possibility is keep increasing technology and just sort of hope and pray to the gods of science that it lasts forever and that people don't notice the fact that they're being crammed in further and further like sardines. Do we want a Project Eden style world where the circumference of the earth is literally larger because everything's nothing but fucking city, and the farms and fields are all on top of, you know, 10-story buildings because there was nowhere else for people to live in order to supply their own needs? I would argue no, that's not a safe, it's not a healthy, and it's not a desirable world. It's a world of nothing but artifice. These social movements should be indicating to those who study these things, these social movements, third wave feminism, men going their own way, whatever they may be, and the sort of things you see in Japan or China or parts of Western Europe where people's mating is dropping off. People are no longer interested in having kids. If they are, they're having one, maybe two kids, not at replacement rate. They need to observe this fact and coordinate it with Calhoun's experimentation. Say, oh, yeah, we're hitting the edge of the behavioral sink. That's too bad, because there's really no way to rectify the situation because we've already gobbled up all the available land. Most of the forests on Earth, if they're still there at all, are managed forests. They're not wilderness. The wilderness is gone, for the most part. Even here, if I look out back, I see a lot of greenery and mountains and stuff. Most of that's not wild forest. Most of it's managed forest. It looks wild. It looks wild to the average person. If the average person was in it, they'd get lost. But ultimately, it's still a managed forest. It's not entirely wild anymore. And this is about as dense a forest as you're going to find outside of the middle of the Amazon basin or up in Siberia or something. This is a problem that this world needs to face, and it's going to come to a head within our lifetimes. I'm 27 years old. By the time I'm 50 or 60, I expect the world population growth to be collapsing potentially, outside of a few regions of the world that will be supplying immigrants. And then what you get is that native populations around the world will simply start dying off in droves, and you'll have to import more and more immigrants. Well, the immigrant source doesn't care because their population density is being kept artificially low because everyone's moving elsewhere. What's the problem? Eventually, you don't have any other cultures in the world. You will essentially end up with people from the nation of Niger or Mali being the world majority just by virtue of the fact that their breeding rate is high enough to supply that many immigrants. You'll have people, I guess, from Bangladesh or something like that. Well, you know, these other cultures deserve to continue living as well, and they won't if these social movements which pretend to be concerned with traditional masculine values or traditional feminine values, if they value the same cultures that are the source of their very existence, then they will breed. Otherwise, they're doing a disservice to themselves because, you know, then they end up in the old folks' home, nobody gives a damn, 50 years down the road or whatever. And the other part is their culture will be ripped apart. It would be a rather sad world, and unfortunately, there may not be anything we can do about it. The doom of our times may not come from nuclear war or an asteroid, but simply the fact that we've outbred ourselves. We've bred too much. We've covered the earth with too many humans, and we're now going to experience a behavioral sink which destroys every culture on earth. I think that's something that people need to understand is a possibility. It is possible for that to happen. It's been done in experimental situations before. So yeah, and again, comments are set to approval only, unfortunately, on this video. I get way too many shit posts. I don't have enough time to deal with them all. If these people want to rant, they've got plenty of their own propaganda to rant on. Most of their arguments are retarded anyway, so I'm just not willing to deal with it. And that includes people who are third-wave feminists and people who are inverted third-wave feminists, which is, what MGTOW really is. They're the same thing. They make the same exact arguments. They use the same exact fallacies. They come from the same behavioral sink that's slowly engulfing Western culture. And they both have the same dubiously European backers, let's say, to use a less pejorative term for those known for rubbing their hands together gleefully at times. That's about all. Peace out.